Well, good evening, everyone. Hello, Chatham-Kent. My name is Philip Mock, and I'm the executive director over at Vision Us. We are a nonprofit consultancy here in the community of Chatham-Kent, Ontario, and we have been very lucky to be able to join you again this evening from 7 to 8 o'clock to facilitate a conversation with myself, Jeff Wilkins, and Douglas Kwan to talk about the Landlord Tenant Board hearings and moving the Landlord Tenant Board hearings online, what some of those challenges have been and what some solutions might be. So we jump into all the content, all the fun conversations, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Doug to introduce themselves. Jeff, I'll start with you.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Jeff Wilkins. I work for the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic. I'm a licensed paralegal that specializes in housing.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jeff. And Doug, yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Legal Services at the Advocacy Centre for Tenants, Ontario. And we're a legal clinic that's funded by Legal Aid Ontario with a provincial focus to advance tenants' rights. And one of the ways we do that is we provide tenant duty counsel services for all the self-represented tenants appearing at the Landlord Tenant Board.
Fantastic. I'm so glad both of you are able to join us again for this conversation. I know we met last Thursday and had a very rich conversation about this topic, but we'll be having a similar conversation tonight. For those joining us live from Chatham-Kent or wherever you're at listening in, feel free to comment below. We'll capture questions. We'll start looking at what questions you have and answering them as best as we can. But before we jump into the Q&A, we're going to start with Doug. Doug actually has a little bit of a presentation to give. Tell us a little bit about what changes has happened with the Landlord Tenant Board hearings. What are some of the challenges and what are some solutions he's seeing from ACTO? So Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Phil. So I'm just going to have the presentation put up on the screen. The Landlord Tenant Board, as many of you might know, is the place where landlords and tenants can have their disputes heard. And over the recent few years, there's been a lot of media scrutiny about its dysfunction and the problems. And it's impacting both landlords in the sense that they no longer want to have their units available and want to pull them and make them short-term rentals. And for tenants who are trying to assert their rights, they can't participate in hearings, their phones get cut off, or they're waiting up to 2 years for the matter to be heard. And so if they can't assert their rights, they're more likely to lose their affordable housing. So that's the state of the Landlord Tenant Board today. But let's go back a couple of years, and I want to tell you about what it used to be. The Landlord Tenant Board is the busiest tribunal of any tribunal in the province, hearing 80,000 applications for a hearing every year. It used to have 44 regional sites across Ontario and 8 regional centers. The closest one to you would be London. All the locations, including the 44 that I mentioned, offered mediation, tenant duty counsel services. They scheduled matters regionally. What that meant was that if you lived in Chatham, you would only schedule disputes with Chatham addresses. And same would apply to the other regions. Also, in some places, homelessness prevention programs like rent banks would open up their offices right next to the hearing location so that tenants who are in need could access their services. The Landlord Tenant Board site that served Chatham back in the day was at the Wish Center on King Street. And the LTB hearings were 3 per month, and they offered mediation, as I said earlier. One of the nice things about in-person services was that it provided a low barrier means of access. So when the people in the community are told your hearings held at the Wish Center, people know where that is. It's identifiable. It's easy to remember. Also, when it was in person, there used to be hallway conversations between the parties, between the landlords and tenants, to try and resolve matters. And we found that almost 30% of all applications scheduled for that day were resolved on that day because of those hallway conversations. But that's all changed. In the pandemic, the Landlord Tenant Board removed all in-person services across the province. It said on November 2020 that even after the pandemic is over, we're going to stick with this model no matter what. Also during that time, the Ombudsman of Ontario started its investigation on the Landlord Tenant Board and released its report in May of last year, having 61 recommendations and 97 pages of what went wrong. So a little bit about the current challenges. A lot of people can't access the landlord-tenant board hearings because they're given just random alphanumeric numbers and try to access their hearing. And many tenants, and you can see a Deloitte study here that found that the majority of Ontario's renters didn't have the minimum level of broadband in order to participate in their hearings.
Wow.
People who didn't have English or French as their first language had challenges participating. People who are survivors of intimate partner violence couldn't have their hearings in their home because it was not a safe place to have them. People with disabilities, literacy, and numeracy issues as well. And so what resulted was we found that the majority of renters participate by phone and the majority of landlords participate by video. And so you would try to convince a neutral adjudicator. It's a lot easier to convince them when they see your face, just like in my presentation today, as opposed to having a black screen with your name written on it. And that's essentially what tenants were experiencing. It's almost as if you're creating a courthouse where one party is with the judge and the other and then you are in a separate room altogether. That's the reality of the landlord tenant board today. What the ombudsman in their investigation found was because everyone was participating by video or virtual, you can only have one person speaking. And as you can imagine, if you've been waiting months or years to have a hearing, and the issues are either your investment is being threatened or you're at risk of being homeless, it's obviously going to be contentious, and you're not, and parties aren't apt to say, I'm going to let the other side speak. So the ombudsman found that those hearings were chaotic, and that people had their didn't have the data or the phone plan in their phones, and they got cut out from the hearings.
Wow.
Yeah, and so what that meant was we saw a significant delay in the backlog. Landlords are waiting 9 months for hearings. Tenants were waiting up to 2 years because of the issues I put forward. And also, I spoke about regional scheduling. Now they changed to a provincial scheduling model. So people in Chatham had to wait in line behind other larger municipalities like Toronto, Ottawa, Windsor, Thunder Bay, and all those other municipalities in order to get their matter heard, which really negatively impacts smaller and medium-sized communities. And so I just want to show you this chart before I finish my presentation on the problems at the board. You can see how in the first 2 years is when they had in-person services, and how they were able to manage 78,000, 80,000 applications, and they were able to resolve them with 48 to 47 adjudicators. Last year, they didn't even hit 80,000 applications. They were able to resolve far fewer matters, yet they had 3 times the number of adjudicators than they did in the in-person days. So this demonstrates that the issues that landlords and tenants are concerned about at the Landlord Tenant Board is a result of their choice to go digital. So I hope that is a decent summary, Phil. I'm open to any of your questions.
Absolutely. What a great presentation. I think it sets the tone for a conversation that, frankly, it's probably frustrating to have, because I'm sure this isn't the first time you've had this conversation, Doug, with colleagues and with tenants and with duty council. You know, I'm really quite interested in how, with the hallway convos, you talked about how around 30% of people were able to get their matters dealt with in the hallway, but we don't see that with an online version of a landlord tenant board, right?
Yeah, they're in this waiting room. They can't talk to anybody. And there's something magical that happens at the board when they're looking over and seeing the adjudicator make their decision and thinking, oh my God, this is my come to Jesus moment. I better take this seriously. I better have honest conversations and resolve this, because, you know, I need to move on with my day, move on with my life. And that's just not happening in these virtual hearings.
And I mean, the wait times, you talked about how, you said, if I'm not mistaken, you said 6 to 9 months for landlords and up to 2 years for tenants to have their hearing heard at the LTB, Landlord Tenant Board.
Yeah, and it's a significant delay. There are some tenant applications that were resolved back in 2017 that haven't received their decision. And the ombudsman found that they treated tenants differently than landlords simply because tenant applications were a little more complicated. The ombudsman said that's ridiculous. It's unconscionable to make tenants wait almost twice as long as landlord applications.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it just speaks to, I think, from an advocacy standpoint, we talk about rights, people's rights to be heard. And you showed with that chart how the wait times have increased so much that people are waiting so long that really there's a question of, are people having their moment in court? Are they having their moment in front of the adjudicator? Are their rights being respected? And even when they're not able to access a hearing because they don't have the technology to access it, how is that impacting tenants and their rights to be heard in the adjudication process?
Well, we've heard stories where tenants are thinking that they're talking to a mediator and they're trying to tell their personal story of how they ended up here, and only to be later find out that they're actually talking to the landlord because they can only participate by phone. We've heard stories about the delays where last fall a person was illegally locked out from their home in Oakville, and it took 60 days to have their matter heard at the landlord tenant board. Um, these are delays that have significantly impacted people's lives. And keep in mind, the longer the delay, the more opportunities that the tenant could experience harassment from the landlord. Because as we know, whenever you try to resolve things through litigation, you're going to invite more harassment. You're going to invite more ridicule, more pressure from the other side. And so these tenants have been waiting for up to 2 years and to have their legitimate matters heard. And so it's something that needs to be resolved. And I also recognize the fact that landlords also have nowhere else to go. This is the only place that they need to go to preserve their investments. And certainly, it's not working for anybody. And there has been talk about, well, let's erode tenant protections, let's do other things. That's completely unnecessary, because all we have to do is see how things were done only 3.5 years ago to know how to fix the problem.
And I think your presentation did that quite well. The percentages, the data shows over and over again the move towards a fully online landlord tenant board, and for hearings specifically, I mean, it has just not worked as well as what we were doing in person. Beyond the data, though, I've even heard stories, and I'm sure Jeff, you've heard some as well, where we experienced people saying, "Listen, I get the online, fine, we're in a technology world, but there's something about meeting in person, that hallway conversation, that one-on-one, face-to-face, that just there's a lot more focus on finding a compromise, that mediation approach, than adversarial. It's very much that online, I don't see you, you don't see me, so I can say and do whatever I want, because there's almost that barrier of hiding behind the screen."
Yeah, you're right, Phil. It's kind of like now, well, not nowadays, but for the last decade or so, texting's the way to do things. And I see when people send texts back and forth, they're pretty adversarial. And yeah, so like Doug had said, we used to do a lot of hallway meetings, and I would show up half an hour early, and there'd be 4 or 5 different representatives for the landlords there, and we would have very candid conversations. And the majority of the time, these would not even go to hearings. We would sit down in the hallway and, like Doug said, have the meet with Jesus meeting with the tenant, and then go talk to the landlord and let them know that this is where we're at. And usually some kind of consent order would come out of that, and that would save the board a lot of times. The members were very grateful, and still are, when you have a consent order. But when everybody met at the same place at the same time, you would have conversations going on with not just tenant duty council and tenants and landlords, but landlords and other tenants. You would pick a corner in the hallway and kind of make that your own and try to sort something out. But now that's not the case, unfortunately. But right now, unfortunately, it is what it is, and we have to learn how to navigate this until something changes.
Well said, well said, Jeff. And Doug, just bringing it back to you, in terms of the challenges, we've heard that there's clear challenges, not only with access, affordability of having data, having the right megabyte speed of internet, not only just being able to participate in wait lines. All these other challenges are occurring for both tenants and landlords. what would ACTO and what are some suggestions coming out of the research of how can we fix this? What are some potential solutions to this?
Yeah, what the province has been doing lately has been adding more adjudicators to try and fix the problem, and it has minimally helped a bit, but it's still not really dealing with the crucial issue, which is that the delays that we're seeing today has been self-inflicted by the landlord tenant board by their choice to schedule matters provincially, to remove all in-person services so that people have less access to their services. So we have a few proposals, and I just want to ask if I can get my deck on the screen here, and I can go through some of them with you.
Yes.
Okay. So we have 6 proposals here. First is to bring back in-person hearings as a default, so that more people can access the hearings. We can have those hallway conversations again. We also want them to move forward on the ombudsman recommendations. Some of the recommendations, such as creating a dedicated tenant adjudication service to deal with the tremendous backlog on tenant applications. Let's move on that. Let's also reopen regional offices. I understand London is a 90-minute drive away, but for those, but where regional offices were providing service, they did a tremendous job in answering people's questions, telling them which forms were right to fill out, how to correct them. Right now, when people fill out those forms, they don't know until the day of their hearing they fill it out right or wrongly. As well, some even tried to go to Service Ontario. Unfortunately, Service Ontario staff, they don't know anything about the forms. They don't know anything about the Residential Tenancies Act. So that's not an appropriate place to seek advice. Those regional offices really provide excellent service for many Ontarians that unfortunately is lost. A navigator program would be fantastic as well. Let's contact the parties. Let's see if they're willing to mediate. Let's see if they need any accommodations before the hearing. Let's see if they need to access Jeff's clinic services. Collecting data and user feedback. Let's find out how many people are participating in their hearings in Chatham. How many eviction orders are we seeing involving Chatham residents? The type of data isn't available right now. And so, but that would be helpful when municipalities, the province, they're trying to address the housing crisis through the LTB. That would be great. And lastly, a return to regional scheduling. So moving back to scheduling matters by region. So Chatham residents could have your regional blocks returned. And so you can see, we took a snapshot in 2018, what that looked like back then. We're not talking 6 to 9 months in 2018. We're talking a month, maybe 2 months that people had to wait. That is the impact of that regional scheduling. Also, what's nice is that when you had your matter heard, adjudicator would understand the housing context in Chatham. They would know how many, at least have a general idea how many landlords there are. There are some communities where there's only 2 landlords, 2 big corporate landlords. So if you get evicted by one landlord, I'm sure the other landlord would hear about it, which means essentially you can't return to that community again. And so that type of local knowledge is important when you're trying to make the right decision. So I think regional scheduling would be key. What it's nice to see is that there are groups out there. There are such as the Human Rights Commission, the United Way, the Ontario Bar Association, who are trying to actively voice their concerns to the province and to the Landlord Tenant Board to change. And I want to commend the municipality of Chatham-Kent Council for doing the same in December of last year. And that letter that they sent was the impetus for other cities to get involved, such as Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, Brampton. We just had a great conversation with the city of Ottawa for regional scheduling, for bring back in-person services. So the momentum is building. And if I was a renter or a tenant concerned about the issues at the Landlord Tenant Board, these proposals are the proposals that will actually fix things. So contact your local MPP. They're the ones who are in charge, and they're the ones who can fix this.
Those are some clear advocacy directions anybody really could take. They could speak to the local MPP, the local member of provincial parliament, advocate for these pieces. I really appreciate the solutions that you're bringing forward here. And, it begs the question, is the province listening? Like, some of these solutions are very, very clean and simple. Let's reopen regional offices. Let's have adjudicators do a tenant only or tenant focused hearings. Can you speak to maybe what is the province listening to right now, and maybe is this working? Is this advocacy working?
They are noticing. They saw the letter from the municipality of Chatham-Kent. They see these letters from other municipalities, and they're taking notice. Maybe they might not move on the first letter, may not move on the second or third letter, but as those letters are being added, as the local MVP is telling Queen's Park, wait a second, my constituents, I really care about the LTV, and they all seem to agree that this is the solution. And I can't see how that can't move the people in Queen's Park to make positive change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, Doug, I'm really appreciative for this presentation, this information. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening is really interested as well, because we're getting some comments coming in fact, and some questions that are popping up right out of the gate are, from an owner perspective, from a landlord perspective, the wait times of up to a year and a half. I mean, for 2 years up to tenants, but up to a year for landlords, there is a serious backlog. And people are wondering, how many adjudicators are on the case? How many people are actually listening and doing these hearings on a regular basis? Is there anything being done to, as you said, the province is hiring more people, but is that really fixing the issue here? Oh, Doug, I think we lost you there.
Oh, sorry. If I can bring up my slide, I can show you the number of adjudicators that they've hired. So, so as you can see, they moved from 46 in 2017, 2018, and in March 2023, they increased it to 127 adjudicators. And as of January of 2024, they're up to 134 adjudicators.
Wow.
So that's like I said, that's more than almost three times the number of adjudicators than they once had. And we're still talking about problems at the board. They're slightly improved, I should say. I have to give them some credit, but I have a concern that all this new money is not base funding. It's coming from contingency funds from the province, as you can see from my last point there. So the province doesn't feel that this is a permanent fix, that this is just a blip, but it's not a blip. If they continue with this model, we're going to see a substantial backlog again.
So what I'm hearing you say is they've hired 3 times as many adjudicators, or people who are sort of I know they're not called judges, they're called adjudicators, but sort of judging the case. But we're seeing worse wait times and no real resolution. This is sort of a temporary fix the province have put in, but we're really not seeing a long-term fix, and it's getting kind of worse year by year, if I have that correct.
That's right, Phil.
Gotcha. Okay. Doug, thank you so much for all of this information. This is really quite critical. And you know what? In fact, our comments are just flooding in, and people are kind of really quite upset with these numbers, going, this is just unacceptable, that these are the wait times, not just for landlords, but also for tenants. This is quite unacceptable. So you've really hit a nerve for the people listening here, that this is quite unacceptable. It's not working for us. Some other questions coming in, though. If it's okay, I'm gonna pop over to Jeff Wilkins at the Legal Clinic over here for a little bit more sort of a paralegal perspective on some of these pieces. Jeff, can you talk to us about sort of on the practical level, what is that notice of hearing? If somebody gets a letter in the mail and it says, notice you're evicted, these big bold letters at the top, I'm sure it says something along those lines, it freaks everybody out. Help me understand, what is a notice of hearing? What does that really mean when I get that piece of paper?
Well, let's start from the beginning. Notice of hearing is after a landlord files another notice from the Landlord-Tenant Board. Most of the time it's a N4 for arrears or an N5 for behavioral issues. And they look scary. There's a big black banner on it that says you could be evicted, and there's a termination date. But let's face it, most people, when they get this in their mailbox and it says eviction and you need to be gone by 2 weeks, they panic. And rightfully so. They don't realize it's just the beginning of a process, though. When they do get these notices from the landlord, that's the beginning of the process. If the tenant does want to move out at that termination date, fine, they have the right to. But if they don't want to, and if they have some kind of argument that they'd like to make at the landlord tenant board, they have a right to a hearing. Even though it is, depending on a landlord or tenant application, even though it is a long wait, they do have a right to that hearing. So in one way, the backup of the landlord tenant board kind of messes around with landlords quite a bit, because before you could have a hearing within a month or two, and the tenant would probably be a month or two in arrears, maybe 3 months. Now that it's taking 5 to 9 months, they're going to be 9 months in arrears. And trying to get help with that, trying to get funding with that, trying to get a repayment plan with somebody that's on ODSP or OW, it's virtually impossible, which means that the municipality has to step up and spend their funds on something that could be used better. But this is a process. So the N5 or N4 or whatever notice has to be filed by the landlord. They file it with the landlord tenant board, and then they wait for a notice of hearing. And the notice of hearing will be sent out to both parties from the board, and it states the date of your hearing, the time of your hearing, and how to participate, either through phone or through the Zoom hookup. That notice of hearing will give you all the information about accommodation if you want or need accommodation. And quite truthfully, if you do need accommodation, ask for it, because that's one of the biggest comments from the landlord tenant board is we have 80,000 applications, but we've only had, I don't know, a couple hundred, if that, requests for accommodation. And part of the reason for that is at the beginning of COVID, they said, we're going Zoom. And pretty much we're silent on that. So nobody really knew about accommodations. They are trying to make it a little bit easier with mobile access terminals or terminals at their service centers. But like Doug said, the local service center for Chatham-Kent is in London, and that's going to take you an hour and a half to get there if you can get there. Right. And you're going into a building you know nothing about, so it's very uncomfortable for the tenant, where before they go to the Wish Center. Most people in Chatham know where the Wish Center is, and we would have those talks. But the notice of hearing is going to give you a heads up that, hey, you're being taken to the landlord tenant board, and here's the instructions on how to participate.
Gotcha. Okay. So the moral of the story really is that even though we have both parties wanting to resolve this issue quickly, there is going to be a wait, and the tenant has the right to be heard. They don't necessarily have to walk out and evict within those 2-week period. They have the right to be heard, the landlord tenant board, if they receive one of those notices with the big scary letter saying you're being evicted.
And if they receive one of those notices, let's not wait till the hearing. Nobody wants something about an eviction hanging over their head for a year. Get a hold of the legal clinic. We're free of charge. If you're on some kind of subsidy, we do not charge. And quite truthfully, if you're a tenant, we're going to give some kind of advice no matter what you make. We're here to try to save tenancies. So get a hold of either your OW worker, ODSP worker, CMHA support. They all know how to get a hold of me and the people that work at the clinic. And a lot of times we can sort this stuff out in a few weeks, a couple months, without even having to go to a hearing. That saves the board time. That saves the tenant a lot of anguish. And the landlord is probably going to be very happy that everybody's coming to the table trying to sort this out, because let's face it, this is a business. Landlords are in the business to be landlords, and tenants, they're the other side of this equation. So this is a business transaction that if everybody goes to the table, we're pretty good at making sure that these things can get sorted out. The longer you wait, though, the harder it is. And if you miss that hearing, if you take the notice of hearing and throw it in a drawer, which is understandable, sometimes you know what kind of trouble you're in and you don't really want to deal with it. But call us. We don't bite. We are very easy to get along with. If you talk to anybody at the city, they're going to say, yeah, get a hold of the clinic. They will try to help out. And that way, even if it does go to a hearing, we also do tenant duty counsel through ACTO. So we're there for the Chatham-Kent hearings. So if you do have a hearing and it does have to go to a hearing, get a hold of us. At least we will be there to help try to negotiate some kind of mediated agreement or consent order. Because a lot of the times, if you get both the parties together and you have a third party there just kind of helping facilitate it, you're going to come up with some kind of agreement that not everybody's super happy about, but they're happy enough that, yes, this tenancy can continue. And that's what we want. That's exactly what we want. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so again, what I'm hearing you say is if you get a notice and you're a tenant, contact the legal clinic,
Right
get
away.
some advice. You're free of charge right away. And it's not just for the tenant's benefit. The idea is that working with you, hopefully there's a way to have some mediation with the landlord so everyone can come out with a win-win solution here before you even have to wait for the hearing a year from now or 2 years from now, is what I hear you say too.
Unfortunately, this is an adversarial way of doing things. And if the landlord and tenant get together at the very beginning and sort stuff out, you can save the tenancy and save the relationship. But what I find is that when we wait a long time to go to a hearing, that's already caused a lot of heartache and grief on both sides. So all of a sudden, even if the tenancy's saved, the relationship soured. And we want to save these relationships and tenancies. We want everybody to not really be like it was pre-COVID because there were still problems there. But before, at least we could have conversations. And the majority of time, I'm not joking, the majority of time we were able to save both parties. And it sounds funny because I work for a clinic that caters to tenants, but I also talk, as you know, Phil, to a lot of landlords and a lot of property managers, and they contact me. And we are able to sort this stuff out. It saves everybody time, money, and a lot of stress on both parties.
Absolutely. And, you know, and this might be a question for both of you, but I'm having some questions come up in the comments here around, Jeff, you had spoken about how even a legal clinic can help with some of the paperwork potentially, because there are a lot of complex paperwork pieces. And now, if I'm not mistaken, the Landlord Tenant Board requires you to upload these documents to some sort of online digital portal. So if you're not very tech savvy, it could be a huge barrier to even submitting your application or evidence before you go to your hearing.
Fortunately, at my clinic, when they started talking about the portal, they said they were going to get rid of fax machines because they were very antiquated. And we told the board at one of the meetings that we use this fax machine quite a bit because a lot of our tenants don't have the tech to go onto the portal, may not have the cognitive ability to go onto the portal, and quite truthfully, we don't have the manpower to help them fill out paperwork. So a lot of times we're walking them through this, and it's not ideal because a lot of our tenants need a lot of help filling out this paperwork. We have had a lot of luck with the city or community navigators at the library helping fill out some of the paperwork, but you're right. The portal is very tedious, but the good thing is that we have enough supports around Chatham where we can at least get somebody to walk you through it. If you bring it to us, chances are we won't be able to represent you just because of the time constraints, but we're going to make sure that you're really prepared to go into that hearing. And the paperwork, if we can just fax it off, instead of having to worry, was this uploaded properly? Did I get everything in there that I should have? When you send a fax off to the board, we've had a lot of luck where we hear an answer within a day of, are you going to get that review? Are you going to get that stay? Now, the fax machine's normally just for urgent situations or parties that have a fee waiver, but those are most of our clients right there. And if they don't mind putting the Landlord Tenant Board fax line on the comment section, that's 1-833 610 2242. And this helps out a lot. It helps out a ton because if I'm not available, if I'm doing tenant duty counsel, or if I'm off, or if I'm doing a hearing, at least they can go to the library and have a community navigator fax this information off for them so that they do get this filed with the board.
Gotcha. Thank you. I mean, that's a great recap of some of the challenges of the digital portal. And Doug, I think you're going to jump in as well. Some thoughts here on your end from what you're seeing, even in the research, just from your experience with this data portal, or excuse me, this digital portal for documents.
Yeah, it's really difficult to ask social service agencies to upload these documents because it involves creating an account, then scanning it, and all the people who are in the caring sector over the last couple of years have been overworked. And to add this additional layer of service that you're asking them, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen as easily. And so the easiest way of accessing the board would be that fax line if they still had it generally available to everybody. But I wanted to also mention that Legal Aid does fund clinics to help tenants, but they also have a place for small landlords to ask their questions. And so we're going to have that phone number available either in the comment section or on the bar below. There you go. So that's great timing. Thank you. So that's a place for landlords who are watching this. That's a place for you to contact who can give you advice. And I looked at some of the comments and asked, well, if they have 3 times the number of adjudicators, why is it so dysfunctional? Why can't we try any other way to solve it? And again, I have to, I'll show you this chart one more time. It's really because they went digital. They removed all in-person services. You can imagine how much interventions are required to figure out where's my password. How do I download this Zoom app on my computer? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of steps involved. Whereas I know where to go to the Wish Center. I know the bus that takes me there, or I know someone who can give me a lift to the Wish Center. There is far fewer interventions involved, so more people are participating. But also think of it this way. The Landlord Tenant Board, as I said earlier, is the busiest tribunal in the province. Much like McDonald's has a very busy business, lots of people going through it, the McDonald's has different ways of accessing their services. Drive-through, app, going into the restaurant, that touch screen. And it's not them who decides which method is best. It's the person who's trying to access their services. They decide. Not so at the Landlord Tenant Board. So they said you all have to go through digital portal in order to access their services. It's like McDonald's saying you all have to go through that touchscreen, and if you can't use it, you have to tell us, and then we'll unveil all these other services that we didn't tell you about. You can only imagine that lineup into McDonald's if they ever were to try that at their restaurants. That is why we have a backlog at the Landlord Tenant Board, not because there are more tenant protections that are necessary, not because there's not enough adjudicators. There are more than adjudicators than they ever needed. It's because they moved and took away all in-person services to Ontarians. They took away regional scheduling for residents of Chatham-Kent, and they took away the Wish Center from you.
Mm-hmm. Doug, I'm glad you brought that back up and really clarified that point, that really the real issue here is the removal of in-person services, because it's all online, everything's digital. Good luck. If you can't figure it out, tough luck. I don't know if it's just dinner time or whatnot. I'm glad you brought McDonald's, because as someone who gets a Big Mac once in a while, right, I couldn't imagine having to wait in these long lines for hours just to access food, for example. So the same kind of concept, you hear that with Landlord Tenant Board. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Not to cut that part of the conversation short, but we have comments just rolling in here, and I want to make sure we get to some questions. Now, let's talk a little bit, if we could, for the both of you, around rent arrears, payments, and different types of ways that landlords and tenants are navigating this. So a couple questions came up around, can arrears or non-payment for rent be enforced? How is it enforced? Is there some type of wage garnishment that happens where they take money off your paycheck? How does that all work?
Yeah, definitely arrears can be enforced. As a tenant, you have the responsibility to pay your rent. A lot of tenants will say, well, I have issues with maintenance. That's still not an excuse not to pay your rent. The quickest way to get evicted is not to pay your rent. That is the quickest route for a landlord to take. And like I said, if you're waiting 5 to 9 months for a hearing, yes, good intentions will be there, and you will say, yeah, I'm going to put the money in the bank till the board decides, but something always comes up. And if that happens, all of a sudden you're evicted. So unfortunately, yes, arrears are a big deal. They used to be the biggest deal at the landlord tenant board, but now we're seeing landlord's own use kind of thing. Right. They definitely can easily go through the process of getting their arrears from you. It's very easily converted, a landlord tenant board order, into a small claims court order, and then there's garnishment hearings, all that other stuff. So yes, quite easily they can do that, and rightfully so. If you do have a gripe with a landlord about maintenance, get a hold of your worker or get a hold of their clinic. There's ways to pay your rent into the board if you do have a maintenance application. So you're paying your rent, the landlord's not getting it, but you're paying it into the board. So all of a sudden that may give the landlord a little bit more incentive to do the maintenance work that's needed, kind of thing. But yeah, if you don't pay your rent, it's like not paying your mortgage or your car payment or what have you. There will be consequences, and they will be dire, and there will be cost consequences also.
Gotcha. Okay. In the same vein of kind of rent arrears, in the opposite, I guess in the same vein, but also in kind of an opposite piece, this idea of cash for keys. This idea of the landlord saying, you know what, I either need that unit back, or I want the unit back for whatever reason, going to the tenant and saying, hey, I'll give you $3,000 if you give me the keys and walk in the next week. Is that legal? Is this landlord tenant board approved? What's going on with this cash for keys? Can you kind of explain what's going on there?
Yeah, it's very legal. It used to happen quite a bit in Toronto. Just because the rents were so high. We're talking 5, 6, 7 years ago. We're starting to see that flow into southwestern Ontario now. We get calls on a daily basis about cash for keys. It's legal. If a landlord wants to offer you, let's say, $3,000 for you to leave your rental unit, there's usually a reason why they want to do it cash for keys ways. And normally it's because they may come to you and say, look, I want to move in. Here's the cash for keys deal. Will you take it? Well, if they want to move in, there's a better way to protect the tenant, and that's going through the notice from the landlord tenant board, an N12, stating that, yes, we are going to move in. And the reason why I say use that situation instead of cash for keys is because if they don't move in, if you move out for $3,000, that's probably going to be spent in a month with the new rents that are out there. And with these notices, they're there to protect the tenants. So if a landlord says, yes, I'm going to move in, and he gives you an N12 and he doesn't move in, there's very big consequences to the landlord for that. They could have to pay for up to a full year your new rent. They could have to pay the difference between the old and the new rent, punitive damages, moving expenses. There are a whole lot of hooks into the landlord at that point. But cash for keys gets rid of that safety net for the tenants, where if they say they're going to move in, I really need to move into this place, here's $3,000, and they don't, and you see it up for rent for triple of what you were paying, there is a reason why they did that. And the same with renovations. Again, they'll say, yeah, we have to renovate this place. Here's the cash for keys for $3,000. But just remember, if you're paying under $1,000, there's probably some incentive for the landlord to say, yes, here's cash for keys. I might be able to triple your rent. But with a renovation, you get the right of first refusal. It doesn't matter if they painted the walls gold. You have the right of first refusal at the same rental amount. So even though they are legal, you kind of have to look at the background and go, why are they not following the proper procedure? And if you do want to do it, I have had clients that said, yeah, you know what, we're going to move into a house. This is a great opportunity. go for it. We'll help you through it. We'll help you do the proper paperwork, because a cash for keys deal written on a letter, that's a little sloppy. We'll make them do the N11 deal where everybody terminates a tenancy and everything's legal and above board. But yeah, cash for keys is legal, but you got to be very wary. Very, very wary of why you're signing this and what you're going to find when you try to find another rental place, because number one, it's going to be way more expensive if you can find something.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a very good point. It's a very good point. And what I really hear you saying, Jeff, is basically any piece of paper that you get as a tenant, any piece of paper, they're going to come and knocking at your door. Give Jeff the little clinic a call.
Give the clinic a call. There's myself and Kim Binder at the clinic. That's what we are there for. And if you can't get a hold of us, or you don't feel comfortable phoning the clinic, get a hold of whatever supports you have out there. Unfortunately, these supports are being overburdened by a lot of the landlord tenant board stuff they have to do now, where they didn't have to before. But they're willing to do the work right now that we need to do to save tenancies.
Okay. Good to
Well,
know.
I saw one more question in the chat about interpreters at the landlord-tenant board. And the landlord-tenant board, they don't offer interpretation for any other language besides French and English. Okay. And so it's really incumbent upon the parties to bring someone whom they trust to interpret, or reach out to a nonprofit or a community organization that is willing to support. It's more challenging to interpret in a virtual format than in person, and because a lot of in the ways that we communicate, it's not just through what we hear, it's also mannerisms and seeing like people motion, and so that's important. And so but yeah, it is a problem. And even with French language services, there's probably 2 or 3 adjudicators serving all of Ontario if you want a bilingual hearing.
Wow.
And so that's been an issue. I know in Ottawa, when they lost their regional center, they didn't have French speakers who could immediately offer services when they needed it, which goes against the French Languages Act. So the loss of these regional centers have had a tremendous impact as well on the service that Ontarians receive.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought it back to some of those solutions you were talking about, that regional centers piece. I mean, even when I was back in the front lines myself as a social worker, back in the day, and I would work with tenants and with my clients, I'd bring them to landlord tenant board. I was living in London at the time, and I would go to the landlord tenant board office, the regional office, and they would have handouts. You could walk up to people at the wicket. They would talk to you. You could actually get information, hand in documents. It was a much more friendly atmosphere, and they would help you.
They navigated your way through the process. Yeah, and now
exactly.
And now you have either a really thick document that tells you how to log in and all that, or a complex website that and you're hoping to understand. It's not the same
no.
at all.
It doesn't sound like it. Absolutely. So a couple, just as we're getting to the end of our hour here, just a couple questions to sort of streamline this conversation around tenants and their process going through landlord tenant board. We know that there are tenants who are going through this process, and not only do they come into the process already experiencing some mental health concerns or some challenges, but they're also in this 2-year-long wait of financial limbo. Everything's kind of up in the air, a lot of stress, which only adds to the mental health challenges that people are experiencing nowadays. If someone has experienced or is experiencing a mental health issue, is there any support for them throughout this process? Does a landlord tenant board offer any funding or support services during this time?
Unfortunately not. If they are having mental health issues and it is very severe, I would say they get a hold of whatever supports are in Chatham. I'm sure, is it 311, Phil, that has the supports in Chatham? I'm not quite sure what number that is, but if they are having mental health issues about going to a hearing, get some help right away. And then the second thing they need to do is get a hold of their clinic or get a hold of their worker, because that's what the worker's there for. But unfortunately, the board doesn't have any mental health worker there on the standby in case something's happening. They'd probably be pretty busy if they did, because I do see a lot of I see a lot more breakdowns via Zoom than you did in person. And like Doug had said, when you're in person, you're face to face. So that person is a real person right in front of you. That single mom is crying right in front of you. You can see her two kids, where if they're on the phone, like the majority of tenants are, they're just a phone number with a phone symbol there. So they're not a real person. And you can tell by the huge increase of adversarial dealings with the board that it's there's no empathy there anymore between the parties, unfortunately. Sometimes you come across good representatives on the other side, and we're used to dealing with each other, and we do have the empathy. But when it's unrepresented, I see so much. They can't see the person in front of them, I guess I'll say. Yeah.
I know that goes both ways, Jeff. It's not just a one or this or that. It does go both ways. And Doug, I think you're going to jump in and say a couple of words on that too.
Yeah, when I was I worked at another clinic before my current clinic, and oftentimes we would see CAMH involved. They would walk their client to the landlord and tenant board hearing. That doesn't happen anymore, because if you're waiting for your one Chatham matter out of 40 matters that are from elsewhere, they can't spend that time. They can't dedicate their resources in the same way. When hearings were held in Simcoe County, I heard from the clinic over there that CMHA was there at every LTB hearing supporting tenants. Wow. I've had clients who struggled with a flip phone, but somehow they found their way to the LTB hearing because they knew it's across the street from the mall. There are visual markers. There's no way that same client who I helped years ago could have attended virtual hearings. No way.
Wow. I mean, these stories just speak volumes. I can tell from both of you that this is not just a challenge that you're experiencing professionally. There's also a personal piece here. You're witnessing both parties really struggle in this process now that it's fully digital. It's fully digitized. There's a struggle mentally, physically, emotionally on both sides of the coin happening here.
It's also taking away a lot of the resources of the clinics, because, like Doug had mentioned, in Chatham, we would have hearings 2-3 times a month, maybe. And we would be at the Wish Center, and we would be there from the beginning to the end, and we would have shelter solutions there, probably CMHA. We would be face to face, and I'd say the number for us was even better than 30%, maybe 50% of the times we would speak with these people in person. Yeah, we'd get some kind of consent deal. Now it went from me maybe doing tenant duty counsel 1 day a week. I'm doing it 4 days a week. So Those people that are phoning into the clinic for help with paperwork, I'm bouncing from Zoom room to Zoom room to Zoom room to look after 3 people, where before it would be just at the Wish Center and there'd be 30 people there. So it's taken up clinic resources. It's also taken up partnership resources, because we're telling the partners now that, look, CMHA, if you're involved, please be there as a support, because that means a lot when the member gets to see that there's a support person there. Yeah. Well, now instead of them just coming to the Wish Center on that one day and helping out 4 or 5 people, they have to bounce from room to room to room. I do understand how this started at the beginning. I was pretty impressed with the pivot they made at COVID, because, as you know, they had closed down everything. And that was great. That was great the way they did that. But the way they kind of went, stop, we're keeping it this way, it kind of, Yeah, it's a shame they did that because I was very impressed the way they handled the beginning of COVID, got things started up again. They just need to listen to the parties involved a little bit more because we're here to help. We're knee deep in it too. So listen to what we got to say. We just want to fix things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just with a couple minutes left here, I know that there's been some comments coming in about questioning, does landlord tenant board help with people who are in month-to-month situations, like if they're staying in a motel in month-to-month, or if they're getting support by other organizations, be it the city or other organizations, to find housing. And if I'm not mistaken, landlord tenant board does not do any of the social support. They are simply there to adjudicate landlord tenant board act issues between a landlord and a tenant. Correct?
They pretty much, before there were more supports, but now you're usually going in front of a trier of fact that is going to make decisions based on the law. That's what it is right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And with a couple minutes left here, if we could do a kind of a quick, big takeaways. What are the biggest takeaways you want people listening right now to take away from this conversation? Jeff, if you could do so kind of from a legal clinic / practical piece, that would be really quite critical. And then, Doug, are you able to sort of give us a takeaway, especially from what ACTO is doing, including some of the advocacy work you're doing to sort of reopen from those regional pieces?
Yeah, two quick things. Landlord comes and asks you to sign something. Don't sign anything until you get legal advice. Nothing needs to be signed that minute. If it is important to get it signed, they will definitely let you, if it's legitimate, go get some legal advice for it. Number two, if you get any kind of notice or anything, don't sit on it. Time is of the essence. Get a hold of us right away. It's going to cut down the stress you're going through, and chances are we may be able to help. So, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jeff. Doug, I'll turn over to you.
I want to say that, yes, the landlord tenant board is in dire straits, but it can be fixed. We know it can be fixed because they were operating almost, I wouldn't say perfectly well, but far better than they have now because they were in person. So if you're a landlord, if you're a tenant, if you're frustrated by what's happening at the landlord tenant board, and you want to make change happen, talk to your local MPP. Tell your MPP that I support what my municipal council has done, that they're calling for a return to hearings at the Wish Center, regional scheduling, open up the counter offices, bring back in-person hearings again. That's the solution, and that's the way and path forward.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you labeled those very clear steps to both of you because it's very clear. If you're signing something, call Jeff. If you need help with tenant issues, call Jeff. Even if you're a landlord, give a ring to Jeff, potentially. I'm setting you up, Jeff.
Stop it with the Jeff thing. Call the legal clinic. There's a Jeff and a Kim, and we do have supports there. So, yes.
Absolutely. Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, you'll see the phone number at the bottom right there. Tenant supports 519-351-6771. And Doug, you had made some really clear points when it comes to advocacy. Speak to your local member of provincial parliament, even our local council, because their ears are open and listening, as they did in December, submitting that document to the province. People are starting to listen and realize that what the landlord tenant board is doing is not effective. We need to go back to, as you said, regional offices. We need to go back to in-person hearings and focusing on regional hearings, like within where you live, not representing all of a province or sector, if I heard that correctly. Am I missing anything? Big. Okay. Sounds great. With that being the case, thank you to everyone listening for all your comments, your questions, for all your intrigue and insight. I really appreciate it all. We all appreciate it. Thank you to those for listening, and thank you to the municipality for letting us have this conversation on their Facebook live stream. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.